Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Wednesday, May 11th baseline show. Thank you for tuning in or joining our live studio audience. Today, we will have a legal themed baseline show with our guest speaker, Benjamin Bukari. So I will first hand over to Ben to introduce himself, and then we'll go through a rough set of topics we outlined and also just open the floor to the others in this call. We have a few other legal community members joining us today in law school and other backgrounds. So Ben, please introduce yourself.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sonal. And hey, everyone, my name is Benjamin Bukari. I am an attorney. I've been licensed for about 10 years from Auburn Hills, Michigan. And I've done a little bit of everything in my career. Started out as a litigation defense attorney, defending corporations and municipalities and localities. And then after that, I made the jump to transactional work. I've done work for some of the major consulting firms in the world, specifically scoped to enterprise risk management, capital markets, broker-dealer services. I've done some telecommunications work with the transition from 4 to 5G. And then most recently, I was the lead attorney for a legal team for a company called DQ Systems. They produce digital accessibility software and services for HTML, mobile web, and native iOS and Android. They're based out of Virginia. However, what brings me here today and what I do with Sonal, the EA, is a CEO and founder of a company called Abachi Inc., and that is a digital asset startup. As we transition and embrace Web3, I figured now is the time to make the jump. And so in collaboration with the EEA and Sonal and some people on this call, we're really focused on promoting the use and adoption of both the Ethereum mainnet and enterprise Ethereum.
Thank you. Awesome. So can you just tell us a little more about the intersection of your experiences and knowledge on tech and law?
Sure. I think it starts probably midway through my career. But my real experience is what I did at my last job with DQ. And that was working with companies all around the world with standing up infrastructure, licensing software, and working with business teams, starting at the very beginning with inbound and outbound sales development through the very tail end. So that would include development, dev services, engineering, information security, and then even up to the C-suite when you're looking at establishing budgets and spend based upon monthly or quarterly targets. When you look at what we see today, and as we delve into the baseline protocol, which is really synchronized business logic and confidential data processing involving the Ethereum mainnet, it's very, very important that we build this new Web3 landscape in a manner that's going to address risk management. And the reason is because of the security profiles and the data that's being handled. We're a digital world. Everyone probably in this call most definitely has an iPhone, or an Android, and there's not much you can't do on those devices. And so as we transition that and launch into Web3, the real focus is piercing different markets and demographics and lowering barriers to entry for participants. And in order to do that, it's not only simplifying a lot of the processes that we have, and that's going to be done through, smart contract automation for one, but also migrating this new technology while also balancing the risk that is involved. So, I guess we could start by, if we're looking at processing personal data, and that's involving the Ethereum mainnet. A lot of these risks are brought about through the commercialization of NFTs, or digital ID programs and DeFi as well. Because those different use cases are likely to involve personal information, it's very, very important to combine on-chain and off-chain storage. That's a way to mitigate risk. So to give you an example of what you would see today in the enterprise landscape, a lot of companies employ different tools for logging, metrics, and tracing. And those are hosted on various clouds or even deployed on-prem. And so what we're going to see a lot of in the future is hybrid cloud or multi-cloud to address regional data localization. And that's important because the data privacy landscape is very different throughout the entire world. Using the United States and the UK, as an example, I'm sure everyone has heard of GDPR. That's more of a broad brush that you can paint over the pond. However, here in the United States, it's much more local. We've got various federal laws that would apply, but a lot of states are also taking initiative, like California, for example, with the CCPA. And the reason that's important for enterprises is not only to reduce their risk profile, but to also adhere to information security standards and not increase their spend in their business teams. And essentially, what that could lead to is fracture within organizations. So, when you're looking at infrastructure monitoring or blockchain visibility, depending on what platform you use, it's important to be able to utilize off-chain object storage, whether that's with structured, unstructured, or semi-structured data sets. But when you actually stand up these instances and basically instead of using, like we do today, with on-premise, which is much more expensive than cloud, you can actually create multi-tenant instances that are partitioned. And the reason you do that is because of the data that you're storing. You can't commingle proprietary non-public information, at the corporate level or with their employees with specific data. So the way that you could deploy that with multi-tenant instances throughout the world, you would have private nodes that would maintain copies of the public ledger. You could have secure vault storage, and then third-party admin privileges for auditors, information security teams. If that's external, that would be for penetration testing of both the infrastructure and the applications. And then that will enable companies to scale through hybrid deployment models. One example would be container orchestration, like Kubernetes, for example. That in and of itself, through the use of declarative APIs, you can bootstrap the clusters and you can simplify the provisioning, the upgrading, and the monitoring. And so it's going to automate a lot of the tasks for the teams responsible for that. And it's also going to allow for the adoption of DevSecOps. And it won't burden your dev teams with having to reinvent the wheel, but rather it's going to bridge the gap between development operations and information security standards.
Hey, Ben, I've got a question for you. This is John
Sure.
Walker. So one of the trickiest things for people to get their heads around, I think mainly because of the heritage of the baseline protocol work, being a bunch of Ethereum folks, is we conflate it a lot with crypto or with blockchain, which drives me crazy because it's at this point certainly almost nothing to do with either of those things, right? It is simply using a blockchain as a bulletin board, and you don't even have to do that. You can use any state machine to be the bulletin board for zero knowledge proofs that signal third parties to do things without sending them the actual clear text, right? So you and I have some common data. We need to prove that we have the same data, like an invoice, and we need to prove something about that data to Jack over here, so that he'll do something like give somebody a loan, right? So, but we don't want to give Jack the data. Or we have a bunch of web services. Like right now I'm building a company that's got 14 web services running it. And I'm constantly worried about the data leaking between those web services to get them to orchestrate, right? These two web services need to do a thing, and then this one needs to do something. I don't want to send that third thing doesn't need the actual data. It just needs a proof that the other two things did what they were supposed to do properly. None of that has anything to do with DeFi, or I mean, you can use that pattern in DeFi. As N Labs is a spin out company from Mesh, not to be shilling too much, but so the question is more generally around law and supply chains and multi-party automation, regardless of blockchain, regardless of crypto, regardless of tokens or coins or schemes. How do you see the use of zero knowledge cryptography and coordination, multi-party coordination playing out?
It's a very good question. I think one way would be, that's transaction validation. And, that was my point earlier about leveraging off-chain resources. So, if you want to utilize zero knowledge rollups, for example.
Isn't it funny that we call it off-chain resources? Back in my day, we just called it resources.
Certainly. Yeah, certainly. So I think you differentiate first and foremost between on-chain and off-chain transactions and how you update the global state, and the rationale for employing zero knowledge rollups is because it's attached to state update, but the transaction history can be compressed on-chain. And for certain verticals, you can leverage DIDs, digital identifiers. And the reason to do that, and that's actually promulgated or promoted by the W3C, which I've experienced through with my digital accessibility ventures. But it's important for a few reasons. And, when you're looking at supply chain or financial services or even distributed IoT, a lot of public blockchains use public-private key pairs, or that's asymmetric encryption. And that can present problems from a data privacy perspective because you're still able to identify individuals based on that information, which, as I was mentioning GDPR earlier, could be problematic. And that increases your risk profile as a company. So being able to compress that data reduces overhead and operating costs for companies, but it also enables them to use user credentials through tokenization. And that would essentially be treating public keys as tokenized assets. And that would be the personal information that you utilize.
Wasn't that an extraordinarily expensive and complicated and heavy way of managing a bit of data about a credential? I mean, I've got friends like Paul Brody who talk a lot about tokenizing like pallets and supply chain stuff. And I'm like, really? Because XML was too heavy for us, right? But, an NFT or a token of some kind is like way heavier and more brittle and more expensive and transactionally more expensive, not just overhead, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, for our mantra around here is data for databases, hashes and proofs for blockchains. So you're not putting, especially if you're doing it right and you have good indirection in your hashing or in your zero knowledge proof, I think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, I think you're safe on GDPR as long as the databases in which the data live, not on a blockchain, are GDPR compliant.
Certainly, yeah. And that is why data localization is so important and it's going to be such a sound investment in the future because it allows you to address head on the myriad data privacy laws, rules, and regs around the world. If you're a global enterprise, you probably have customers in the United States, the UK, throughout EMEA, then you look over at Asia as well. And so that allows you not only to meet those standards, but from an object storage perspective, it simplifies and streamlines your operations because it aggregates data in a way that could be structured or semi-structured. So it's much easier to query offline, certainly.
I've got a question. Looking at kind of the GRC approach of, a multi-party process environment, much like baseline, what happens when you've got, this multi-party environment that is really composed of a bunch of participants around a common purpose and a common goal? When something goes sideways, how is the determination made of where do you find the throat to choke? As far as if it goes down, if somebody, all of a sudden operates outside of the agreement, or maybe has a data breach and has to shut down, and has the other participants having to wait on them, and there's financial consequences to that. Is there a method to say, okay, where did it happen, and who do we censure or penalize?
That's a very good question. So I suppose you could address that through smart contract automation and coding. You have functional considerations and legal considerations. Depending on the parties involved, is it a consortium? What is the business purpose? What kind of data is being handled? And, what was the breach? And, who's ultimately responsible? And, one of the best practices to employ with smart contracts would be a hybrid model where you have a traditional vehicle like you would today. So if we're licensing software under a subscription license or a software license, SLA, or if you're performing services, under an MSA, you could aggregate both. But it's best to keep fluid concepts in the traditional contract. And fluid concepts would be ones that it's hard to anticipate certain events through coding. It's conditional logic. That's the functionality of smart contracts, but it is very difficult to envision each and every circumstance that can happen. And that's why it's very important for legal and development to be on the same page when they do that. So, to give you one example, let's say that you've got a payment mechanism and the smart contract is coded to release funds upon a predefined set of conditions, but it doesn't happen for whatever reason. The reason it's important to use a hybrid model with traditional and smart contracts is sometimes parties, it's much better to grant a grace period, rather than just a termination. Or if there is a privacy breach, like you said, who is responsible for what was penetrated, and that goes your information security posture. And
I think a lot of that is going to have to come down to probably worth noting that there are no smart contracts in baselining, right? There's like one, right? There's you have to manage the Merkle tree on the of proofs on the blockchain, right? But beyond that, there aren't any smart contracts. It's mostly you could write smart contracts around it, I suppose, but it's mostly zero knowledge circuits. So in a way, zero knowledge circuits are replacing the transactional rules, right? I mean, smart contracts having been a poorly named thing from the beginning, they're not contracts, and they're not necessarily particularly smart, but they, the name stuck. But in our case, you would say the rule, a rule has been not followed, so this circuit can't complete. Right, so it will fail backwards. That's actually kind of nice and acid that way, right? You just can't get to the next state of the next state transition just can't happen because you didn't follow the requirements. I think at that point, Mark, it has a lot to do with just good old fashioned. Hey, we're in a consortium, or we're in an organization or we have decided that we're going to work together. And if you don't do your part of the thing and you stop this process, we can't get to the next state change. We have lots of ways of getting redress, including I'm going to call your boss, or hey, fix it, or I'm going to sue you, right? I don't think we can smart contract our way out of that.
Do you have an undivided common interest in the governance and control as far as, who owns it, who hosts it, who is the one that, really kind of is the first among equals as far as when there is a dispute, how do we decide and who casts the vote?
Mm-hmm. Very good
speaks-
questions.
Yeah, that speaks to what Ben was talking about relative to SLAs. How you going to tie SLAs to this?
That's exactly right. And depending on who the injured party is and what are the remedial measures. So in the traditional software licensing world, it depends on mission criticality and uptime requirements, which would be the SLA. So if you don't hit a certain standard, like 99.5%, which actually for business critical applications is low, then you get credits, and those would be remitted either money exchanging hands, or you could have credits that would just be credited to your subscription fees in the future. That's a much easier way to do it because it allows the companies to avoid disputes, and it builds in the structure, and you can do that through exhibits or riders through the SLA, through the software license, to address those remedial measures. Another area that you could also escalate, and someone just mentioned it, is going to C-suite. And actually, that's one of the most effective ways to resolve disputes. You could always leverage ADR, alternative dispute resolution, because when you have enterprise relationships, the last thing you want to do is take your client vendor to court. It's just that's going to fracture the relationship, and you're going to spend a lot of money on legal fees. And so potentially you could agree to informal ADR, such as mediation, or formal, which would be arbitration. And if you're looking at the consortium, you could even have some of these terms included in the membership agreement of, if there is a dispute amongst members, you have to resolve it in this manner. Part of the reason that arbitration is much preferred in this context that we're talking about is because a lot of that is done under seal. It's not public like it would be to go into a federal court. You have the parties that are briefing an arbiter, and it's much more cost effective because you don't have the potential for appeals. If you have an adverse ruling, which could take years and years and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, but it preserves the relationship, and that's ultimately the most important goal when you have a setup like this.
Thank you. And Otto, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I do agree with John Wolpert's initial assessment of smart contracts and the hype, right? And unfortunately, this industry has, gone through some of that where we overpromise what blockchain can really do and what its actual effect is. But I was really interested in the concept of Ricardian contracts. And you being a lawyer, Benjamin, you probably heard of this, right? I find that concept really interesting in having both a sort of, code section to it and then like a interpretation of it, right? And then sort of the signatures indicating this is the intention of this contract. So then in the event of a dispute, it's not only the machines disagreeing, but they could actually potentially take it into a court of law. What are your thoughts around that? Just overall, and you see Ricardian contracts being a thing in the future, maybe?
Very good question. I do, but it does have its pros and cons. When you look at traditional contract formation, you've got a few principles. Meeting of the minds, offer acceptance and consideration. So when you automate certain tasks, and in the event something goes wrong, there's a breach of contract, is it immaterial or is it material? Immaterial would be the example I gave earlier, like a payment, a mispayment. A material breach would be a data breach, or an event that has significant consequences for the actual transaction, at bar. So one of the really important areas right now and that's developing is the Uniform Commercial Code. And with automating a lot of these contract drafting and reviews, it's very important to make sure that you meet at a bare minimum the common law elements for formation. Because if you don't, let's say you automate a lot of the coding, but some of it contains erroneous code, then what happens if a claimant not only doesn't have standing to go to a court because it's actually a computer doing the work as opposed to an entity or an individual? That can present a lot of issues with jurisdiction, governing law, redress. So if you're looking at a material breach, let's say, a data breach where an organization's proprietary IP is exposed, and that is the most valuable, that is the bedrock for every company. Typically what you do is you can go seek redress, equitable relief, through a TRO or preliminary injunction. And that's beneficial because it allows the parties to continue to perform, but it also allows courts to issue orders. When you're automating a lot of this, sometimes courts won't necessarily be able to do that. And so, one solution could be ordering a party to provide the keys. Or if you're looking at the smart contract automation, another solution would be having a master smart contract make calls to subservient contracts. And that way, if one of the calls is erroneous, you can revert back. And, the judiciary could take advantage of that and order a kill switch through the master contract. And so it's building in redundancies in the system to account for erroneous transactions that aren't necessarily possible to address with discretionary authority through individuals like we normally do.
Very cool. Yeah. And do you think that, eventually courts will take up, a Ricardian contract and, maybe a dispute resolution type situation?
Yes. If the parties have contractually agreed on ADR, courts usually honor that. It's a bargain of the relationship between them. Benefit of the bargain is the legal jargon for that. Another consideration that we've seen, and I don't think it's even an issue, it's maybe just a collateral issue right now, is smart contract execution and digital signatures. So if someone raises that kind of defense, there's a federal law on point for that, and many states are getting on board as well. And essentially, you can't use that as a defense. An electronic signature is valid under most circumstances. But I do think courts will defer to the parties like they always have if they've contractually agreed to it.
Very, very cool. Another thing I was wondering about, whilst I have you here, is sort of, we've been interested, at least at EY, in using sort of zero knowledge proofs in our platform that I'm working on, the project I work on daily called TaxGrid, to perhaps prove attributes about investors without revealing their identity. And I believe that's what, a lot of the other identity platforms are also very interested in. You might have heard of Polygon ID. They're sort of going for a similar attempt at, giving out attributes of investors without revealing their full identity, and, that being a valuable feature of the platform. What are your thoughts around eventually governments looking at a zero knowledge proof that, speaks to an investor's, X attribute, accredited investor, for instance, and eventually evaluating that as we're satisfied with this proof. We don't really, at least initially, want to know who's the person behind that.
Yeah, I think governments will eventually get on board with that. There's a saying of regulation always follows innovation, not vice versa. And that's never in history it has the law. And in fact, it's impossible for the law to envision every possible innovative feature that the private sector will come up with. And so I do think they will lend credence to that and honor that, as long as it complies with certain frameworks like data privacy. Information security is very big, and regulatory compliance and reporting. If you can use digital identifiers, that I think is going to, in the future, replace credentials that we use today, like name and password, phone numbers, because it's a much more way, it's not only more efficient, but it's more secure for people to use. If you're looking at your client base, for example, the reason that you can use JSON formatted metadata, you can deploy that at the application interface. And I think that is really where there's going to be a tremendous amount of opportunity in the future, the application layer of the blockchain stack. And so employing these measures and allowing people to access applications worldwide through their smartphones using DIDs, I think, is such a tremendous use case. And I can't wait to see how it develops over time.
I think I agree, but why is blockchain essential? I mean, look, I play for the team, but I also try to, not allow myself to get too wrapped up in the group think of it all. Why is blockchain essential? I mean, the API economy, definitely essential, right?
Yes.
And what you're talking about, APIs, JSON, all that stuff. I was reading a bit of the standard for EDI, not because it's so fun to read EDI standards. Well, they mentioned a lot about how there are levels, right? There are times when you don't need to have a non-reputable agreement, right? You can go on without that, and there's a cost to getting non-repudiation. Where does the unique aspects of blockchain come into play and make it essential? And when can you just get away with a good set of APIs?
That's a good question. One example I think would be blockchain-based tokens. So, what is the cost benefit for adopting this technology? It's more efficient, but using
we don't do tokens on this in baselining. There are no tokens, but yeah.
Got it. The best way to approach this would be through the risk profile and the investment you're going to make in the infrastructure. And so utilizing zero knowledge proofs allows you to compress data, to store it in a clean manner, which is reducing your overhead for a lot of teams. It's going to reduce your spend. It's going to allow more synergy through your development and your engineering, your information security teams. That's important because it also goes to your information security posture and vulnerability management. Over time, what we're seeing is if you have legacy systems that are outdated, or you don't have active threat hunting, for example, it's going to increase potential vulnerabilities and threat actors from penetrating those. And so, looking at this baseline protocol, not only from a business investment perspective, but just looking holistically at each one of the teams involved, it allows direct transactional work to be done in a secure, immutable manner, where a lot of what we do today is much more complicated. And it's because of the complications with the infrastructure we have. It takes a lot of investment at the corporate level to not only maintain their postures, but to justify increased spend through that in the future.
I think that's right. I think, and that's where baselining can be oddly and as we often say, boringly, boring being the new exciting, boringly important, because of course you don't want to put data on a blockchain if you don't want your competitor to know about that data, right? I mean, blockchains are digital news colonies. The nice thing about a public blockchain is that you don't have to spin up another Kafka to do a signaling mechanism between systems, right? And so you can say, hey, look, we always go here, but we don't tell that thing anything because we're just throwing a zero knowledge proof on it. And then I'm going to say, hey, so watch for that thing. When that thing shows up, run it through your validator, then do what you're supposed to do. The nice thing is then there are no disputes about when signals happened, right? Because without, the problem with doing that without zero knowledge is then you're giving up too much information to the public or to a very, very giant threat surface with 100, even a private blockchain is a pretty scary threat surface for a CISO. At least with a public one, you have this public always on tamper resistant state machine that you can use as a bulletin board. If you can get away with telling it nothing, if you have to tell it stuff, you better be okay with everybody knowing, especially in the age of AI, right? I can make you in 7, a high school kid can make you in 7 transactions flat with no identifying info on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
throw
I
a
couldn't
little
agree more.
chaff into those. Yeah, throw a little chaff onto those Merkle trees, and you don't even know which proofs mean anything.
Precisely.
I think that could be a good product folk on the call. Is an interesting product for a year or 2 or 3 from now would be one where you say, hey, I need to prove to somebody that all these events happen in the right order. And we are not required to give up the data to them, even if it's a regulator. But if we can package up all the proofs and say, these are verified, these are the proofs that generated all these state changes among us. That's easy peasy, right? It's all public. You can just pack it all up and say, find these pointers and do your thing. Throw it in your spreadsheet,
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes, exactly. Nail on the head. Well put.
Any other questions from the group?
Well, which jurisdictions do you think are the most kind of cutting edge in understanding, blockchain tech and like really, allowing for experimentation around things like this, where you want to eventually start, recognizing code and like the intention of the code, as we have in Ricardian contracts?
I think here in the United States, the states that come to mind, first and foremost, Wyoming. Wyoming is at the forefront of this. They've got a lot of law already on the books and some legislation pending specifically on point for this. They've taken the initiative with DAOs and, a lot of their statutes already address what we're talking about today. So Wyoming, Delaware, then if you're looking at electronic transactions and smart contracts generally, Tennessee, Nevada, Ohio, those come to mind.
Gotcha. Any thoughts in Panama, the recent crypto law?
I have not had the opportunity to read it, but I will, and you can shoot me an email and we can take this offline.
All right, cool. Thanks.
Any other questions from the group? Yeah, I just came across this article from the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology. I have not gotten a chance to read through it yet, but I think the basis is in the title itself. It's called The Application of Zero Knowledge Proofs in Resolving Disputes of Privileged Documents in E-Discovery. And it's about how E-Discovery has been widely adopted for disputes over the last few years. Do you have any thoughts on this? I know I didn't give anybody a chance to read it yet, but how do you see zero knowledge proofs being applied directly to the legal space?
Yeah, so if we're looking at disputes, I suppose a good benchmark would be how it currently exists today. So e-discovery is actually one of the most efficient and cost-effective ways to manage discovery. And that is because you're using a lot of data and you're tagging it and classifying it a certain way based upon certain rule sets. It would be, and using zero knowledge proof with compressed transactions or transaction history, excuse me, it would be akin to using anonymized data like you see with data privacy, or de-identified is another way of saying that, where the actual link is maintained by the proprietary enterprise. You're not providing to the other party. And in litigation today, a lot of that happens with privilege logs. So if you're going to be producing documents in a dispute, but you don't actually want to produce the substance, all you do is note that, and you have to state the rationale for withholding that information. You can give, what is it? When was it sent? What does it include? But you don't actually have to produce the documents themselves. Zero knowledge proofs I see being applied in the same manner. And that's where I hope, lawmakers and regulators memorialize these concepts, because it's just a brilliant invention for Web3 of how we can actually attach each state update commitment to ensure its correctness. So without producing all of the information, because it's proprietary.
How awesome would it be for corporate email systems, corporate messaging systems, even Slack, Mongo, any kind of database, to be coming out right out of the box with baseline standards compliant features that would allow you to go, okay, we got to do discovery. We're always worried about, I'm sure that everybody here has had the experience of going, don't put that on in Slack, or don't put that in an email, give me a call. I never liked that, because I'm kind of a Boy Scout. I'm from Michigan, like Ben here, and we're, we Dutch Reform culture, right? We're, yeah, I can get away with it, but I'm not going to do it anyway because I'm, ethical. So I never liked that conversation. Like, oh, don't talk about it on an email. I'm like, if I can't talk about it on an email, I don't want to talk about it, right? But wouldn't it be nice as if you could say, I'm a little less worried about that, because in a discovery process, I can flip this switch and have a feature that allows me to comply with discovery, like that, without necessarily having to go clear text with everything. That'd be really cool.
Certainly, and it would reduce the legal spend, on outside counsel fees. Because when you're a big enterprise and you're hit with a lawsuit, your legal team, your general counsel, and associate GCs and the rest, your litigation team will kind of spearhead that with outside counsel. So in the very beginning of a lawsuit, there's something called initial disclosures, where it's essentially just at least identifying relevant information to the causes of action. And then when you get into discovery, you have 3 buckets, essentially. They're interrogatories, request to produce, which is producing information, and request for admission. So specific questions that are directed to individuals within the company. That is written testimony. And what you're talking about is the document production. And back to Sonal's point about that article with e-discovery, that's why that's so beneficial, because when you're dealing with a lot of information, it's very, very hard and costly to parse through all of it to find out what is relevant and what is not. And by that same token, what is privileged and what is not. And so looking at who the parties are to the lawsuit, chances are there could be multiple plaintiffs and multiple defendants, typically how it plays out. So, another way to do that with, if you have one of your customers or a very important vendor that was also named, you can enter into joint defense agreements with them and kind of coordinate strategy. So with the consortium, that would even be more beneficial with deploying zero knowledge proofs.
I have a question, Benjamin.
Sure.
I wanted to ask, what do you see as like the biggest hurdle of adopting this technology as it applies to the legal field, to up and coming lawyers just learning about this stuff? Where law students like myself and Adam in the chat, we're both fascinated with this technology, but honestly, not many people at our school really know about it. We do have a blockchain course. It's like the first year they're teaching it. So it's the ball's rolling, but most attorneys I speak to, professors, don't really know a lot about this.
That's a good question, and thank you. And it's I can empathize. I remember those days when I was in law school, and so looking at new ventures and new opportunities, I think the best way to approach this would be just learn as much as you can about the new space. And with the courses that you could take in law school, sales, I think learning as much as you can about the Uniform Commercial Code. Secure transactions would be another one. So Article 9, Article 8 with investment property. And there's actually an amendment to the UCC pending before the Uniform Law Commission right now. It's Article 12, controllable electronic records. So just a few notes about the UCC. Today, how would you categorize or define cryptocurrency or digital assets? It basically falls into one of two things, either investment property or general intangibles, and that's relevant for secure transactions, securitized debt obligations. And so that's going to be very important in the future. So Article 12, I would definitely read the draft of that. And then just general principles about bridging the gap with the legal landscape and emerging technologies. I think best practices, smart contract best practices, the hybrid models that you could deploy at the enterprise level. So using traditional and smart contract automation. And then information security as well. One of the very big developments in Web3 are DAOs. And there are some very, very effective DAOs today. Some will be very influential in the future, but we have seen some significant hacks and loss of funds. And so, when people are forming these entities, it's very important to ensure that they have the proper legal protections and liability shields.
Hey, Ben, on DAOs. I mean, DAO's not a blockchain, a baseline thing, but let's talk about DAOs.
Sure.
What bugs me about DAOs is when we get into this business of saying, oh, here's a token and you can use it to vote. And then you have to stop talking because you can't say, and coin go up, right? Or, basically it's a conceit. And talk about this thing about not being able to put in writing what you want to say in one-on-one, right? I'm troubled by this, right? I mean, I want to be able to, I'd love to live in a world where anybody can gamble with, what they can afford to lose on startups. That would be an awfully nice world to live in, right? And I wrote a piece on this a few years ago called I See Go on Medium, how I See Go saved grandma from getting fleeced. And, this notion that even, if you're your grandma, you got $1 million, you're a credit investor, you can't afford to lose your $1 million, right? Even though you're an accredited investor, right? So, how do we protect people, but also make this more liberal for investing and get away from this BS about, oh yes, maybe someday it will be valuable and that's why you should get it. And everybody starts hodling these tokens for what? Because they can vote? Clearly that's not why they're buying it. And what say you to all that?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's kind of what we see in the industry today. It's a lot of individuals are more concerned with, the appreciating value of a token, and they're not actually buying into the underlying tech. I think that's the next chapter that's on deck once we get through this lull. But DAOs are fascinating because it's a way to reinvent the traditional corporate entity formation and management in a way that's never been done. And so that's actually one of the things I'm doing with my startup. I just finished one of the important attributes for it. But essentially, if you look at DAOs, if you form a DAO and you create a token model for it, but you don't actually create a legal entity. Those people are considered general partners. That is problematic for many, many, many reasons. But it also doesn't account for the information security posture of DAOs, which we've seen hacks, and there are a litany of examples we cover. Part of the reason you want to form legal entities, even for DAOs, is because you need to delineate between members. Are they administrators? Are they normal members? Are they just participants? Liability shields for everybody involved in case something goes wrong. And then, you look at DAOs, the actual business scope of what they're doing. Token economics is very important. You allocate the portions for community contributions or for white hats, for ethical hackers. If you can't afford to hire a CISO or even a virtual CISO, that is a way to improve the security landscape for your DAO, because it's a white hat ethical hacker.
So you give them tokens in the DAO in exchange for doing that. Have you not created an investment in a common enterprise that one is expecting returns from, and is that now not a security? And if all DAO, if the answer is yes, then you have to ask, how many DAOs would actually get created if they had to do KYC on their members and prove accredited investors? So I do think that they're fascinating. I love the idea of basically an automated trust fund with trust fund allocation mechanisms. That's cool. How they're being used a lot is to try to get back to the unregulated security dance, it seems to me.
That's a good question. And in fact, I'm going to be doing a webinar upcoming, I think it's the first week of June for the EEA. So I'm co-chair of the tokenization group for the EEA. And our first webinar is going to be about security tokens. So the gist would be capital raises for digital asset startups. What's the difference between ICO and STO? For DAOs, one solution to that problem would be creating stateful, self-contained JSON web tokens. That in those tokens could have both fungible and non-fungible properties. So if you're looking at Ethereum, traditional ERC20, if you want to get up into the security token landscape, you're looking at 1400, 1404, and then you could even leverage, NFTs. So 721, and then you also have the EIP 4910, which enables royalty-bearing NFTs. So, at an enterprise level, that's a way to promote recurring revenue streams and augment your cash flows.
You made a bunch of our day, because I don't know if you knew, but 4910 came out of a lot of folks in the baseline community, and Andreas Freund in particular. So
very cool, and props. It's an ingenious creation. Well done.
Now you just made my week. That's awesome. Did you know that? Did you know that we were all involved in that, or a lot of us?
I did not. Nope.
That's crazy.
I did not. But I'm a big fan.
Hashtag EIP 4910. Yay. Yeah. You got. I have to think that at the end of the day, wouldn't you say that the, whether it's NFTs or whether it's DAOs or whether it's remember utility tokens, can't we just do the damn work and change the law? Have we just completely given up on actually changing laws? Do we have to break them to change them? Cannot we say, hey, you know what? Yes, if you sell this to grandma and on the expectation of her selling it to somebody else for more, it's a security. But if you're using it to buy storage, you don't have to use a broker dealer. Why can't we regulate on use as opposed to on type as we do today? Why not just change the damn law to make it smarter? Do the work. Why do we have to paper around and language ourselves around, to try to fool people into thinking that we're doing something other than what we're doing?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the point I made earlier about how regulation always follows innovation. And, when we're looking at is something a security or not, the relevant inquiry is under the Howey test. And I will go into very finite detail on this in the EEA webinar series and tokenization. I'll give that information to Sonal and she can disperse that, cascade that to everyone.
It seems to
if
me
you're-
that if we avoid the Howey, if we find a way of getting around the Howey test, 50 years from now, we will have reasserted the Howey test in some other form because we will have generated the same old violations that caused the need for the Howey test in the first place, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if anyone's ever read that, but orange clothes. So there's another prop pending, and it was proposed by Commissioner Peirce from the SEC. It's a safe harbor proposal. And essentially what that is, it exempts certain projects from filing certain required statements with regulators as long as they can adhere to the framework. That's still pending, and I'll cover that as well in a few weeks. But that basically says it's a way to avoid the Howey test. You know, it gives you a 3-year window, a grace period for the initial development team to spin it off. Because when you're creating something, even including DAOs, you know, you still have a centralized structure in the beginning. There's no way to get around that. But that's not a drawback, and I don't want that to inhibit innovation. You know, that's one area where I think it's so important to address, because a lot of people are on the sidelines and they won't execute because of that, the potential ramifications from not only at the federal level, you know, if you're looking at the SEC with securities, but you know, that's why I think some of the frameworks that have been established by states, Wyoming and Delaware, are the two that come to mind. But Wyoming has a great structure, and I encourage everyone to read their statutes. I know we probably don't have all lawyers here, and I don't want people to drown in the legalese, but it's incredibly educational material, and it's the framework for DAOs that I think will be leveraged in the future.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Ben. We are past the end of our hour, but there was just so much to dive into. And I've gotten a few comments that this is one of the best shows we've had to date. It was so awesome to have you here, and hope to have you on in future shows. If there's anything of interest to you, I'll make sure you're invited, but you are always welcome to hop on. We do this every week. Thank you so much for your time, and send me those resources to the webinar you'll be doing, and I'll disperse among the community. Thank you all so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.